This week on FAS TV, we head out to Islay and to the beautiful Oa Peninsula to meet Stuart Lamont at Kinnabis Farm. Concerns about the effectiveness of fluke treatments has been a problem for farmers in Argyll for the last few years. A project on Islay in partnership with RSPB, farmers, Moredun Institute and Elanco Animal Health have been monitoring the fluke status of their livestock to make informed decisions about when and, if needed, treatment is necessary and what flukicide product to use.
So the farm here on Islay, it's an RSPB reserve, but we're farming 2,000 hectares, mixed of sheep and cattle, about 100 head of cattle and about 400 ewes. We're running predominantly cross Highland cows, but we've got a herd of about 30 Highland cows that we're using to cross. Some of them going pure for replacements and some of them getting crossed. Just recently switched over to a shorthorn bull from a cemental, just to try and bring the size of the cow down. So yeah, ongoing with bringing the size of the cow down, trying to reduce our inputs and reduce the impact on the ground. We're currently running about 400 black faces, but they're getting phased out into a Cheviot cross, and we're just going to keep crossing with the Cheviot just to try and get some more value in the lambs. Not really seeing much of a difference between the size of the animals, but it's a more valuable lamb to sell at the end of the day. So from the farming side of things, it's a little bit more beneficial.
We manage primarily for chuff, which is a rare Scottish speciality here that's only found on Islay and Colonsay. We also manage for other species such as hen harrier, corncrake, twite, loads of really specialist species, and we manage virtually the whole site through different types of farming, primarily livestock farming.
So the challenges with fluke on this farm are, I think, probably mirrored across all of west of Scotland really. Wet winters, very difficult ground, a lot of what we're farming here. So we have had issues with fluke. Some of that's from triclobendazole resistance. So what we've been doing is we've been testing we've tested for triclobendazole resistance and moved away from triclobendazole, and then just looking at when we're actually dosing the animals at what time of year. And so we were part of this project looking at when was actually the right time to dose the animals, and if they needed dosed, and to dose them with the right chemical. Part of the project we were collecting both. We were collecting blood and fecal samples. We were testing these new pen-side tests. Predominantly we're testing fecal, and then if we need to we're taking blood and trying to find out at what stage of the life cycle the fluke is at, as to whether what we're testing for, what we're dosing with and when. What we found was that we were actually, the particular winter we did it, we would have been dosing too early. So we found we didn't actually need to dose until the end of December here. So it was actually a drier winter that year. But what it's shown is that it's actually a very movable feast as to when, it could be as early as September, or it couldn't be as late as December, January, just depending on the year. So the testing was quite important to actually not waste time and money by dosing animals that didn't need it. Particularly with where we are now, actually gathering the sheep in to dose them can be a bit of a job. So we don't really want to be doing it if we don't have to. So the fecal samples have been quite a good thing to be doing. Just whenever we do have the animals in, we can test and actually get results quite quickly now to know whether we need to dose or not. So historically we were just dosing on time of year and very routinely, and I think that's obviously what's led to the resistance with the triclobendazole and actually not doing much benefit for the sheep and also for the wildlife. So because we're an RSPB reserve here and we're farming predominantly for the wildlife, actually having an impact on the invertebrate population is what we're trying to reduce. So that's actually been a big driver of why we're doing this. But the flip side of that is that we've actually, we've saved money. So we've paid a little bit of money on testing, but we've actually saved a lot of money on saving on dose. Yeah. So we got involved with this project through Dave. Actually, Dave was been talking to Philip and looking at the invertebrate populations. So the main driver is for the chuff. So the chuff rely on the dung invertebrates through the fledging period. So we actually needed to see what impact we were having. So as a part of a wider project, we've been looking at other drugs as well. And then the fluke was something we were dosing for very regularly. which I think was having an impact, and some of the drugs we were using. So that's how we started off with that, and then joined up with a few other farmers on Islay to actually have a slightly larger project to get a better picture of what was going on.
The RSPB reserve is an important habitat for rare birds such as the chough and golden eagles. Corncrakes can be found nesting during the spring months, whilst on the coastal heath, marsh fritillary butterflies and many other insects are found in this habitat. Focusing on fluke treatments is important for site manager David Wood to help preserve these species.
So the reason we started looking at fluke issues and for the conservation side was that years ago we did a study looking at dung beetle and dung beetle larvae, and also fly larvae in cattle dung primarily, and why there was less food available for chough now than there used to be. And some of that study looked at the vet meds that we used on the cattle and the sheep, and we found that even though we'd stopped using certain vet meds that we knew had a negative impact, the replacement chemicals also had an impact. So triclobendazole was what we've been using for fluke management, and the study showed us in 2012, 2013 that triclobendazole also had an impact on invertebrate larvae in the dung, and therefore less food for the chough. So we wanted to work out how we could manage that issue better, but also maintaining really high welfare standards for the cattle and the sheep. During lockdown, when we started looking at Teams meetings and things like this, and we had a bit more time, strangely, I managed to get involved in a little group that Philip was leading that was looking at the impact of vet meds on wildlife and how much knowledge there was out there and how easy it was to get that knowledge. And through that just made some really good contacts with Philip and Matt from Elanco, and got me thinking that there was support out there that we could sort of ask for help, because previously we'd have been sort of struggling to work some of this stuff out ourselves because fluke's really complicated, the testing's quite complicated, interpreting the results of the tests is complicated, and then knowing what to do, you know, if you're working it out for yourself, you're not really going to be sure if you're right or not. So having the experts sort of on the end of a video chat just meant that we felt like we could do it. So I asked them for help, and they said, yeah, let's do a trial, and it was something they were really interested in. So yeah, we went for it. So when we were setting up the trial, it was mostly just asking their advice, because there was things that we wouldn't have really known how to do, like using sentinel lambs, because understanding the life cycle of fluke is so complicated. So having someone that you can ask, is this the right thing? And they say, yeah, just use your sentinel lambs, your first year lambs. They can't have fluke because of the time scale that's involved in when the sort of fluke become active. So you can test them and you know that that's this year's problem, and if they haven't got fluke, then you haven't got a problem yet this year. So that was really useful, and it was mostly just asking questions like that, designing a load of testing, knowing how often to test, how many animals to test, all this sort of stuff. So yeah, it was just all done remotely, and then as we got to know, then we sort of invite them out and they helped us on site as well and sort of looked at the landscape with us and things as well later on. Some of the conservation grazing that we do, so we set up grazing systems that suit certain species, and that's not always the best thing to do to sort of control your parasite burdens in your grass and your soil and your dung. So that's definitely an issue for us. That sometimes you can manage that risk by maybe, so for getting rid of sort of the wet bits, not grazing the wet bits at certain times of year. As if we're managing for breeding waders, which we are here with lapwing and curlew, we will need to graze these bits in the summer and autumn. And therefore, we increase the fluke risk for our animals. And same with the chough. There's a lot of work being done now on sort of tall grass grazing and things like this, where you reduce the risk. But we need to keep short grass for chough to be able to forage, because they like to eat soil invertebrates, dung invertebrates. So if we've got long grass, they can't feed. So we're kind of doing things that aren't always the best thing to minimise the risk of sort of parasite burdens in your animals. So then we need to think about what we can do with the system that we're in. So in here, I've got signs of tunnelling, which is the big geotrupes, dung beetles. And down here, you can see the tunnel going right down into the ground, and then go up to 1 metre down, laying their eggs in there. But what that does is that's taking dung into the soil, improving the soil, getting rid of some of the parasites, improving drainage and filtration, and also just providing a really good food source. So the adults are great big beetles, so they're a good food source. And then some of the other dung beetles that will be in the dung, the larvae, are a really good food source for chough. They'll just come along and break the pats open, and there'll be all sorts of fly larvae and dung beetle larvae in here.
So what this project has done is has made us look a little bit more in depth as to times of year we're dosing, what we're actually doing. doing a lot more testing, and testing first rather than dosing first. So looking at a lot of that, and looking at areas where we can maybe avoid grazing at certain times of the year. So we've had a look at kind of what's fluky habitat on the reserve to see if we can avoid it. Sometimes we can't because of what we're trying to do with regards to the birds here. We're trying to grace most of the reserve most of the year to make sure there's dung there. So sometimes it's tricky, but actually just by testing, we're actually just being more precise about whether we actually do need to dose or not. So when we did the project, we were testing a proportion of a flock. So we had a flock of about 150 in the area that we were testing. We were doing about 10 or 20 of those. Routinely, we were only taking samples off about 10 sheep out of a lot, because we run about 3 different lots on the reserve. So taking about 10 and pooling the dung samples to get an idea of what the whole flock was doing, and also sometimes just testing particular animals that you may be concerned about. So individuals would sometimes get tested, particularly with cattle. We were doing that more with the cattle, but with the sheep it was about 5 to 10, and the cost between doing that and then actually not having to dose them for that particular period was significant.
Off the back of the project, we realised that we had triclobendazole resistance. So even though we knew triclobendazole had an impact, we were obviously trying to minimise our use before, but with the testing and then the efficacy testing, we found that we had resistance. So we were using a chemical that was having a negative impact on invertebrates, and it wasn't actually helping the livestock. So there's no point carrying on with that method. So now we're carrying on with testing, working out when we've got a fluke risk, only treating when we've got high burden, and then using a chemical that we know works. So even though we're still having to use a chemical that will have an impact on dung invertebrates, we're treating animals that need treating at the right time of year, minimising that usage by not treating them at the wrong times of year, and then also reducing the risk of creating resistance from the other drugs by not using it at the wrong times of year. And being more accurate, weighing the animals before we treat them, all these sort of things that are kind of becoming more and more normal, but in the past were quite unusual things to do. What we did before, we did a lot of testing. We were trying to move our treatments into the winter months when there's less invertebrate activity in the dung and the chuff aren't as reliant on dung invertebrates in the middle of the winter. But that can only work on certain parasites that are active at that time of year, whereas this is what we found with the fluke, is that the timescales are changing. So the times of year when we would have treated in the past aren't necessarily when we've got a fluke problem. So in the past we would have started treating in, say, September, but the year we did the trial we didn't need to treat till January. So by not having to treat for fluke for all those periods through the autumn, which is a vital period for chuff foraging in dung, we got rid of that sort of risk to invertebrate life.
Philip Scouse, Principal Scientist at Moredun Research Institute in Edinburgh, has been giving advice to Stuart and David throughout the project about what tests to perform and when to treat the livestock. The team would like to send thanks to the University of Liverpool, who are developing the lateral flow kits which were used in the initial testing on Islay.
Yeah, we've been doing a little bit of fluke work on Argyll as well, over on the west coast of Scotland, because it's got a lovely mild wet climate and that really favours the fluke's life cycle. So we've been involved in that area, and then we got asked by Elanco and the local vets if we could help with the project specifically on Islay. It's typical of the Argyll fluke story, we can run the diagnostic tests and help advise farmers what's the best thing to do. I mean, we're a research organisation really, but we have the capacity to run these as diagnostic samples. So Gillian, our research assistant here, is an expert at doing fecal egg counting, and the fluke's eggs and faeces are a very good indicator of a fluke infection. Because what we've discovered with our own work in Argyll was that fluke has become quite sort of relatively low and late, so we see it much later than we would have expected to see it, and that can catch farmers unawares, because historically what we've done there in the past is treat at a certain time of year with certain products, and that's really not sustainable. So this is really about trying to time the treatments better, and then once a treatment goes in, make sure it's worked. So the egg counting is a sort of cheap and cheerful entry level way of doing that, and Gillian's a real expert at that. The ideal combination is to do an egg count on the day of treatment and then 3 weeks later and see what's happened to that egg count from those animals. I mean, it can be quite a comprehensive test where you look at a specific group of animals and follow them before and after treatment. But even the sort of crude composite test can tell you whether the treatment's basically worked or not. That's really important to know, because if you put a treatment in, you assume it's worked, and if it hasn't, then it can be storing up problems for later. In terms of how many animals and which animals to test, I mean, farmers obviously can't test everything, it just gets too expensive and too difficult. But you can test smaller numbers of animals. So for the fecal test, we typically recommend 10 or 12, but with the egg count can be made into a composite, so a single test and you get a single readout. For the copper antigen, that would be done on the individuals in those groups. With the blood test, you're looking for much younger animals. You're looking for first season grazers, because that will indicate the first time they've encountered fluke, because any older animals could be antibody positive from last year, so it doesn't tell you a lot. So it's about knowing what the different tests do and who's the best group to treat. But basically, management groups is the kind of thinking, and if that's done properly, it gives you an indication of even where they're picking up infections. So that's really valuable, where and when they're picking up infections. So you're starting to risk assess your farm. So it's using the right test on the right animals. I always feel sort of sympathy for farmers, because they have lots of animals, and you know, if they're going to be doing things, gathering lots of animals, they might think, well, this is an opportune time to treat them. But we really need to be a wee bit more targeted than that. And you can use a smaller group of animals to indicate what's happening to the rest of the herd or the flock. And typically 10 or 12 is the number we would use for fecal tests. The egg count is, as I say, the kind of entry level. There's another test called the copper antigen, which is a little bit more expensive. It needs to be done on individuals, but you get a bit more information out of that. And there's also a blood test, which is actually the earliest test to go positive. That goes positive within 2 weeks of treatment, or within 2 weeks of infection. But that is a little bit expensive, has to be done on individuals, and needs the vet to take the samples. So really we were just trying to come up with a practical, sort of reasonably cheap method that could indicate what's actually happening on the farm. And I think we were surprised at just how late the fluke season was. It was several months later than we might have anticipated, and farmers would have, with all the best intentions, gone in with a treatment way too early with a product that probably wasn't going to work. I guess it's not so much getting them to change the timing, it's about monitoring so that you know when the right time is. Because the parasite we're dealing with here spends a lot of its life cycle outside on pasture, so it's exposed to the climate, the weather, changing weather patterns. So that it's a moving target. We can't assume it'll always peak in November like it used to. We're seeing it now into the winter time. So that's really the message, is about using the available diagnostic tests, understanding what they tell you, but using available diagnostic tests to tell you when's the peak time to treat, what's the right product to use, and prove that it's worked. And I think that's the message, rather than just changing for change's sake. It's about targeting, optimizing treatment. It's also coming back to the guys on Islay. I mean, they're keen to treat as little as possible, because they're dung beetles and various things they're very keen to manage too. And we need livestock and dung beetles all working together, because that's a healthy farm ecosystem. Yeah, I think sustainability is at the heart of this. It's to be able to control and manage fluke sustainably going forward, because if we treat too much too often with products that don't work very well, then we're going to lose the very few active ingredients that we've got, and that's going to make livestock farming very difficult in a fluky environment. So it's about sustainability of the business for farmers, but it's also sustainability in the broadest environmental sense, where because some of the frontline flukicides and wormers have adverse impacts on dung beetles and things, and dung fauna, and these are important ecological engineers. We need to conserve them, manage them too, because they're feed for the choughs that David is managing on the island, amongst other things. So it's important, just in the bigger picture, that the whole thing is sustainable. The whole enterprise, if you like, is sustainable for everybody.
Matt Colston is one of Elanco Animal Health's technical consultants for ruminants, and has been involved in the project from a pharmaceutical point of view.
Philip had started a discussion with David Wood and others on the impact of animal medicines on the dung insect population. He invited me in to join that one as a representative of a pharmaceutical company that makes a lot of these products, because we're looking at ways of making sure that the animals get the treatments they need, but we have minimal or no impact on the environment as far as possible. Managing liver fluke when you've got triclobendazole resistance, it can be very difficult. the best way forward is to monitor the Fluke challenge so that you're only using treatments when you need to, and then by monitoring the Fluke challenge you know how old the Fluke are inside the animal, so you can target them with an active that's going to be effective for that age of Fluke. Elanco were involved many years ago in a discussion with SCOPS and the Cows Parasite Control Group to pull together a protocol for effective, sustainable liver fluke control. So that kind of generated the 4 basic principles for liver fluke control. And these are pasture protection, so preventing fluke eggs getting onto the pasture. Pasture management to reduce the snail population and snail habitat areas. Grazing management so that you don't graze susceptible livestock on these high risk areas when there's a fluke challenge there. And then fourthly, strategic use of the right actives at the right time for the right animals. So we haven't changed the message, it's just trying to make it easier for farmers to implement it well. I think the first message to get across is if people stick to their fixed time treatment protocols, they'll be missing the fluke more often than hitting them. And the work that Philip's done in Argyll and again on Islay and other projects that we've run in the past where we've monitored farms, those that are on routine treatments will have treated too early when there's no fluke there in most years. And it's the fear of being caught out by an early fluke challenge that makes farmers do this. So I can understand the fear, but we do need to not treat every year at the same time, because the fluke responds to the weather and the weather is changing, so we need to keep up. So every time we expose the fluke population to a treatment, we're selecting the ones that can survive and putting them back to keep breeding. And that's really dangerous for liver fluke, because that part of the life cycle in the snail is a clonal expansion. So if we have one fluke surviving that gets into the snail for the next generation, that can produce an awful lot of fluke challenge for the next generation. So we rapidly change the population if we select for resistance that way.
Following the project, what advice would Matt, David and Stuart give other farmers and crofters with fluke issues?
From Elanco's point of view, we want people to use the products effectively and not waste them. And I can see there's a real strong drive for more environmental awareness. But the best way to reduce, and every product goes through a full environmental assessment before it's allowed out. You know, it has to do that for licensing purposes. And so as long as products are used as per the data sheet, then the environmental risk is minimal. And we can reduce that even further by only using them when we know they're going to do some benefit for the animals. So that's where the monitoring comes in. You know, it's a benefit for the farmer because they're not wasting time and money. It's a benefit for the environment because any tiny risk that might be present is minimised. And I was talking to David about dung beetles when we were on Islay, and he was saying, having medicines in the dung is not good for the dung beetles. But what's even worse for the dung beetles is not having fresh dung. So we need to keep grazing animals in these areas, and if there's a fluke risk, we need to make sure that we're maintaining the animal welfare, because fluke are really not good for animals. And we need to balance the two. But if we're going to graze these fluke risk areas, we have to take care of the animals first.
If other farmers are having fluke issues, I would definitely say test your animals, and also test for resistance to certain chemicals as well. Triclobenzol, I think a lot of people are going to have issues with that now, just because of way people have been managing that drug and using it. So definitely test, and then if you can avoid certain areas of the farm, have a look at the farm, look at the ground, and if there's particularly wet, boggy areas, just try and avoid grazing it if you can. It's not always possible, but definitely test Especially with the new technologies that are coming out, it's very easy to get quick results now as well. So we've been using this FECPAC machine, which our vets is running for us. So we can get the samples sent to them. We can get a result in the afternoon now. So we can have them gathered in the morning, and we know by the afternoon whether we need to dose them or not. So if they don't need dose, they can go back out, and then if not, we can dose them and then put them away. But yeah, definitely test for, if you think you've got resistance issues as well, definitely speak to your vets and do some resistance testing for that as well.
I think if you know you've got Fluke on site, and that's the first thing to work out, is to do some testing, and it's just testing and testing, and speaking to your vets, asking the experts, because they give you so much time for free. You know, you just kind of feel like these are busy people and you shouldn't be bothering them, but most of them are really willing to give you sort of advice and help. And then just following that advice, setting up your testing, maybe not taking on too much in 1 year. If you starting from doing no testing, it messes with your head trying to think of all the different parasites and all the different tests. So pick Fluke, look at that with your vet, think about all the testing you can do in 1 year and get your head around that. And then also looking at your farm, where you graze and how you graze, timings. If you can get all that to kind of break some life cycles of parasites, then that can do a job for you. And then you might not need to treat when you do your testing in a future year.
Hello and welcome to the July FAS TV Vet Update. Last month we saw record-breaking warm temperatures across the country, but this month the rain has come to cool us all down and to help the grass grow. This mild, wet weather is perfect for parasites, so it's important in the coming weeks and months that we're vigilant for that. It's really important though not just to blanket treat for worms, because using worming treatments when they're not necessary can contribute to problems with wormer resistance. Through the summer, regular performance monitoring, so checking daily live weight gains, and taking fecal samples to look for worm eggs are two really useful tools to help you and your advisor work out whether treatment for worms is indicated. In Scotland, we're really lucky because there's currently funding through the Preparing for Sustainable Farming initiative to support animal health interventions. So this means that farmers can claim £250 per animal health intervention, and sampling for gutworms in cattle and sheep count as two separate interventions. So speak to your vet about what the most appropriate samples to take are and when you should be taking these samples, because this funding is an opportunity for you to review and revise your current practices for the benefit of flock and herd health. In addition to seeing if worming treatments are needed, if you do have to use worming treatments, it's also a really good idea to submit fecal samples post-dosing to check if that worming treatment has been effective. Because if it's not been effective, it would either mean that the dosage given was incorrect, or perhaps there's an issue with resistance. And if you've got resistant worms in your farm, you need to know about it so that you can come up with a plan of action with your vet or advisor. There are two really useful resources that have got lots more information about parasites in cattle and sheep, so check out both the COWS website and the SCOPS website. If you are treating for worms and you're using a dosing gun, be sure that you take your time and do the job carefully and correctly. Check that the gun that you're using is the correct size for the class of stock that you're working with. Check that it's not got any rough edges, that it's in good working order, and that it's been calibrated correctly so that you know that it's giving the right dose. Unfortunately, every summer we see problems with dosing gun injuries, particularly in lambs, and in the post-mortem room recently we've seen lambs that have died because of these injuries. These lambs have presented with swellings under their chin, and when they've been opened up we can see that that's because of abscesses that have formed because of damage to the back of the throat. So do just be careful when you're carrying out these procedures, and if you're in any doubt, get advice from your vet. So gutworms are not the only parasite that can cause problems. We can also see issues with lungworm in cattle at this time of year. We've not many cases of this yet, but I would expect in the coming weeks and months that we will possibly see more of it. Ideally, young stock would have been vaccinated against lungworm prior to turnout, but if that's not been the case, you should certainly be vigilant for signs of coughing cattle at grass. It's usually a problem of young stock, but occasionally we'll get problems in older cattle as well. So if you are seeing calves or adult cattle coughing, be sure to get the vet involved so that we can make sure that we get the right diagnosis and instigate prompt treatment, because prompt treatment is really vital to make sure that the effects of this disease are minimised. The other parasitic disease that we've been seeing a few cases of recently, particularly in the west of Scotland, is babesia. So babesia is a small parasite transmitted by ticks that can cause bleeding problems and presents often as cattle passing red urine. This can be a particular problem if cattle are introduced to a ticket area when they've not been on tick ground before. So if you are seeing cattle passing red water, or if you're considering bringing in livestock from an area that might not have seen ticks before into a ticket area, then do speak to your vet to get advice about how best to proceed. So that's all for this month. Tune in next month to see what our vets have been seeing across the country as we head into August.